and at Birzeit University, it's also the dialectical relationship with the Palestinian community, Palestinian people in Palestine, where we also bring into the discussion their understanding of political dynamic reality in the U.S., the forces at play in the U.S., the political supporters and the political allies, we both African American, Latino, Asian, lesbian, gay, and focuses that sometimes does not get presented, or of course gets distorted when they get presented with the U.S. Embassy-supported American Studies projects. And in the presentations that we gave, we brought that. Robert Kelly, Bob, all of the people on the panel, we brought different focuses trying to not only speak to being supportive and bringing this project and learning from Palestine, but also bringing the political reality of U.S. empire within and how that shapes and affects the political course of the question of Palestine, Israel, occupation, settler colonialism.
I just want to say a couple of things that I didn't get to. I think it's really important, and following up on what everyone said, is when we think about teaching Palestine, is where do we do teaching Palestine? It's really important not to think about only the classroom. I mean, one of the major issues last year, 2 years ago, and Diane was on that delegation, the first ever prisoner solidarity delegation that was on it, Emery Douglas, Diana Block, who was at the NWSA conference but not here, Han Jones, one of the SF8, former Black Panther, and so on, and many, many people who were there, and many former prisoners, in Palestine people say freed political prisoners. I think here the term is former prisoner, but and the delegation before in 2014, Junaid and Joanne and other people, and it's just a question of thinking about the prison as a university comes out a lot. The whole question of where do you learn and where do you teach and how you do all of it. So that's actually like quite interesting. And I just wanted to say one thing before we go to, I guess, the discussion, is that we are going to have, we've had Teaching Palestine internationally in Palestine. We went to Cuba to the Caribbean Studies Association because Mamira had the connections and we were able to actually present in Cuba. And we presented at the World Congress of Middle East Studies, and in mid-March, March 18th and 19th, we're going to be in South Africa. And the call for papers is coming out. We're just waiting for the translation in Arabic, because An-Najah is working on the translation so we can put it out. And there will be a call for papers for people who are interested. And the other thing, this is about Teaching Palestine, the project itself, the conferences. But we're also planning, we submitted a proposal yesterday, and we hope it will go through for a study abroad in Palestine from San Francisco State University to take students from the university to actually team up with a course in Palestine, in An-Najah National University, with whom we have an agreement. And it will be a accredited course of 6 credits. Now, we did everything. We crossed the T's and dotted the I's. We think they're going to keep coming up with technicalities in order to make it not happen, but we are determined, and it will be in the summer, in July. And so people can also, apply and participate in it. So I think it will be really great, because we're not doing it as solidarity tourism. We actually, we engage in a lot of gatekeeping and a lot of stringent applications and a lot of ways in which people are going there in the spirit of critical solidarity, not just to go kind of like watch and come back and just report on whatever. Yeah.
Thank you. One final round of applause before we go to Q&A. Just want to acknowledge that I think that let's take a few questions let's take a few questions at a time, and then we'll ask the panel to respond. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
If you wouldn't mind just saying.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lubna. Yeah. Okay. Got it. Actually, I have a question maybe to offer everyone on the panel. Many years ago, panels like this wouldn't have been possible. We weren't seeing these kinds of conversations happen as regularly and with as much attendance and as much interest. And one of the things that I think in Palestinian communities we're really struggling with was the question of how Palestine was being taken up, especially after Oslo, as this like singular issue, void of a history, separate from its own geopolitical context, and it's a hyper-visible issue in some ways. And I think that now there is kind of a return to placing Palestine in its historic sort of third world joint struggle frameworks that it's always been in. One thing that I struggle with, and I will admit that I participate in this contradiction, is this teaching of Palestine in the classroom through kind of a really shallow politics of analogy. You only have an hour, you have to teach Palestine and make it legible, so it's like, oh, Palestine, just like Native America, Palestine, just like South Africa. And a moment that it became very clear to me that in some ways the politics of analogy could actually be hurting us in some ways, was when I was meeting with these Palestinian youth. By the way, I didn't mention I work with the Palestinian youth movement, and in Sweden, and a couple years ago I met with this group of Palestinian youth, and we had this huge argument amongst each other about whether Palestine was or was not an apartheid context. And it became very clear in that moment that everyone was using the language of apartheid because it's become popularized with BDS, but saying that having differences of opinion on whether Palestine was or wasn't apartheid, but there was this assumption that South Africa was totally freed from its apartheid model and everything's nice and beautiful down there. And so there wasn't really an understanding of these other struggles. That was one example of how this really simplified analogy politics can hurt us. So I wonder if any of you have tips in the classroom of how we can deepen the politics of analogy in a way that is really genuine and reciprocal and historicized, and how we can hold each other and our colleagues accountable to sort of the abstraction or commodification of the analogy politics that I feel like is happening a lot with Palestine.
Thank you, Linda. More questions? Please.
No, you just stand up because we can.
Okay. Hi, thank you all so much. I was wondering if y'all could talk a little bit more about the place of land and farming and agriculture, since that seems to be present and important in a lot of the different locales that y'all are focusing on, and specifically in teaching, like teaching on land and teaching on farms, etc.
Oh, okay. Actually, maybe what I want to ask later.
Please, you need to.
Oh, Janine. So maybe what I want to ask later. So, when I'm sitting here listening and I'm thinking about, just kind of possible, they're just like fantasies. They're not real proposals or something like that. And I'm thinking that, there has to be a trickster somehow. When I'm thinking about, African American, there has to be a trickster somehow involved in this. And so I'm wondering about ways that if you were thinking of a trickster, how would that trickster set up, instead of, say, analogies? I think actually you all are already doing this in some sense, but certain structural frameworks, and land and farming would be one of them, militarization would be another one. These lenses, setting them up through which you would be able to look at, if you were looking at Puerto Rico or if you were looking at Palestine. But you start from the place of structure. Actually, when I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking of a book that I use, and it's not that the book has the kind of complexity I like, but it has a certain structure to it, and that's The Color of Wealth. And so when you use The Color of Wealth with students, and they first of all have to see what wealth is, and then they take Native American people in the U.S. context, and they take African Americans, they take Asian Americans, they take Latin Americans, and talk about the dispossession of these groups through that particular structure. And then what one can do is link that up to other things like a racial contract or whatever. But I guess I'm just saying that so that you don't end up with maybe analogies that don't work. Well, let me tell you what my trickster is imagining. The trickster is imagining a certain kind of framework built around the things that you think are important to white settler colonialism, and even calling the text, say you all were writing it together collectively, because these are authors that did The Color of Wealth, that's a collective, calling it Teaching Palestine, but in fact, actually you're teaching certain structures And it would always leave room, whether you ever talked about Palestine right there in that context, it would always leave the people in the locality to talk about all those things, and then you would just be giving examples from particular locations of those, and so it would leave open, that kind of openness to it. So that's just
We have additional time, we have 20 minutes left, so we'll get back to the panel.
So nobody else has, there people have burning questions. Nabil has.
Yeah, so my question is more sort of geopolitical than pedagogical in nature, but I hope you'll still answer it. So a couple of years ago, Joseph Massad wrote an article talking about the way that sort of Palestine and the Palestinian question has been de-linked from its regional context, particularly.
Maybe if you stand up.
Okay. So a couple of years ago, Joseph Massad wrote an article talking about how the Palestinian question and Palestine itself has sort of been de-linked from its regional context, particularly talking about Arab politics. So, this is a very multiracial panel. But I was wondering about, thinking about how like what's going on in the case that Palestine does get de-linked from what's happening in the Arab world, particularly when we talk about Yemen, Egypt, for example.
Thank you.
Yeah, all the questions. All the
I want to talk about the land, actually, and I think, and this relates to my sort of militarism lens, is in many ways, I think Palestine is an environmental disaster, right, because of the occupation, as is any kind of a militarized situation. So when you talk about farming, right, I think it's important to think about the quality of the land. And there is rich farmland, right? There's a whole other piece to this discussion about farm production and all that. But I think the Israeli occupation, the cutting down of trees, thousands of trees, the building like there's no tomorrow on the small land, right? So I think I just want to throw in the environmental piece here as an important consideration.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of address the first question, which is a really important question because, by the way, there's a collection of essays that Sean Jacobs and John Sosky put together called Apartheid Israel, the politics of an analogy, and it's a critique. I mean, there's lots of different essays. I have an essay in there, and it's a critique of the limits of analogy. And I think it's a really important question because sometimes it's easy as a way of translation to impose struggles that are not necessarily specifically Palestinian on Palestinian people. And sometimes it works in ways that it's used to bludgeon Palestinian struggle. Like, for example, the idea that, because BDS is a nonviolent civil society demand, that somehow that's analogous to all the nonviolent civil disobedience, say, in the United States or in South Africa or someplace like that. But what that basically means is that you basically wiped off, and I kind of hinted at that, you wiped off the right of armed struggle and self-defense against, which is not just self-defense, it's the struggle for land, for sovereignty. And so even if you're going to do analogy, there's some analogies that are better than others, but then there's some that are that are safer than others, which erase Palestinian struggles. So we could talk about the Nakba and history of violent dispossession, but there's something very specific about the Nakba. And also part of the problem with analogy, and this is something that I've written about, is the way we also erase, we can call it South-South, we can call it people of color, we can call it oppressed nationalities who are Zionists. And so the Black liberation movement has been pro-Zionist for the most part. It's only really into the 1960s when you see a shift. And why that's the case, I mean, I've written a little about, but that's something that we need to pay attention to, because there's this kind of romantic idea that somehow there's like the white supremacy produces these clear-cut divisions, and it doesn't work that way, you know. Let alone talking about class formation, and tensions around sexuality in Palestine itself. And the final thing I was going to say about this just has to do with why apartheid, even though apartheid could be a problematic term, there's a distinction between the analogy with South Africa and apartheid as a crime under international law. And that's a very different thing. That's why it's relevant, I think. Because you don't have to make an analogy with South Africa to recognize that Israeli policies should be condemned under the international crime of apartheid as defined by the United Nations, which try to take not just the South Africa story, but look globally at forms of dispossession and structured segregation and violence, and figure out a language, and to me that's actually worth considering if we're thinking about even the chimera of international law as at least a basis for making a certain kind of argument. But I know what you're saying though, when you're teaching this stuff, sometimes people like that, but I fight with my students around this all the time, because they want to make analogies not just between Palestine, even within African Americans. They want to say, well, I'm an oppressed black person, so I'm like a prisoner. I feel like I'm a prisoner. I had students come to my class, middle class students, saying, I feel like a prisoner, because I'm as an Afro-pessimist, right? I feel like I'm a prisoner. And I'm like, if you could, there's a kid in the assistant in front, his name is Javier. He actually served 18 months. Go tell him you feel like a prisoner. He's in my class. Go talk to him. Tell him, and let's have a conversation. Of course, he won't say anything. So analogy is great to try to help understanding, but also could be a limit.
I also want to echo that, and I think there is a lot of writings in South Africa by different people. Some people who are saying it's not apartheid, specifically in order to defend Israel. I mean, really, to save Israel. So this comes out of like Zionistic, but there is also a lot of there is a whole lot of complexity of writing in South Africa by people who have studied apartheid for a very long time. We'll talk about it. But I also find it really troubling that people want to escape the historical analysis. It's a very easy thing to kind of say everything looks the same. I mean, it's sort of like solidarity and so on, but I think it's also a quick fix. Rather than engaging in the complexity of histories, understanding what, and you can just keep saying, no, this is not what it is. It's actually, this is not what it is. It's much more complicated than that. And then people don't want to hear it. It's not only students who don't want to hear it, it's also activists who don't. I mean, actually, I think that's even more problematic, because students in the class, at the very least, as a teacher, you can assign material, and you're going to have to quiz them on it, and they don't always listen, but you can actually try to use your being the educator there to kind of like argue with students and so on, and kind of like try to get them to be more critical about things. But I think it's really one of the biggest problems is the movement, in the sense that people always want to say this is like it is. Like we were in WSA, ASA a few years ago, and then some people said that SJP is SNCC. Look, okay, please. I mean, how much, I don't want to underestimate SJP or overestimate SNCC or something, but they're not the same. Each one has its own context. Please go study the histories and then come and tell me that this is the conclusion. And if you convince me, it's okay, I will go with you in it. But I think it's very anti-intellectual tendency to really escape learning. And I think this speaks a little bit to what you are saying, Nabil. I am not sure that Palestine has been taken out of its Arab context. I think maybe in the US circles, but in the US circles and the US academy and so on, and if MESA is the indication of where we are doing knowledge and so on, I mean, it's always been out of its context, and it's always been thrown in another context, and a lot of it has a lot of colonialist, orientalist discourse. So I think, I mean, in the discussions, there is a tendency among dominant hegemonic Palestinian discourses to only speak about only us and ourselves, and we are the most oppressed people on the face of the earth, and we're alone, and it's the last occupation, and all of this exceptionality, business, and so on. But that's actually not the case. When you are reading the Arab writings of oppositional sort, when you read serious Palestinian intellectuals, politicians, political activists, prisoners, and so on, I mean, when you really follow it, there is actually a very vibrant discussion that is going on. It's also, there is a very vibrant discussion going on here among people who are really serious about, they don't want the quick fix, okay? And among scholars who are also, I don't want to even use the word allies, I hate the word allies, because allies basically gets people off the hook and makes it as if it's charity. They can come into alliance, they can leave or whatever and so on, and I think everybody is implicated. But our comrades, our sisters and brothers with whom we are working on the project of production, justice and the knowledge production. And there is this discussion that there are spaces for it where we can have this and resist this kind of very seductive, it's a very seductive tendency to cut across things and make everything look the same and just produce that. I think it's very shallow, as Lubna is saying. It's very shallow scholarship, it's very shallow, and it actually doesn't last a long time. I mean, we can do it today, but then tomorrow you scratch the surface, something happens. How are you going to explain it? I mean, something happens somewhere about something. You have to be able to explain it, and unless you really know the historical context and the developments, and so I think that I think we really need to push people to be more accountable also in their learning and in their teaching and so on, you know. And I just think the last point I want to add about the land is olive oil. I would just say olive oil. Because now is the season, and this last week, they've been cutting trees, the settlers and the soldiers have been cutting trees after trees after trees, have been stealing the olive harvest, have been reducing, and I know this because I and my siblings, we own a very small piece of land that's only left. And I'm always yelling at my brother, when is the olive oil, the new one, is there, send me, okay? So this is even, every year is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, the harvest. And the reason it's getting smaller, because of environmental degradation, but because also, I mean, overall, general climate change and so on. But it's also because there is deliberate effort, day in and day out, to deprive people of their livelihood, to dissociate them, sever them from their very existence and their relationship to the land and their connection to it, and basically destroy any possibilities of Palestinian existence. I mean, olive oil is also part of the existence, so it's there. I would just invite people to look at it.
I'd like to add something to that. Excuse me. In terms of the land, which I'm not really knowledgeable and I don't really address it, but I do think that it has a lot to do with colonial reality in many ways. And I know that, for example, in Palestine, the way the Israeli state has redeveloped the landscape by creating, for example, forests, parks on stolen land, planting pine trees in place of the natural trees that grow in Palestine, changing the landscape and affecting, and the water, for example, the diversion. I remember the first time we had that I saw the Jordan River, and I had this vision of a river. You know, the Jordan River. And when we got to it, I said, where's the river? And then, of course, the person explained to us that as a result of Israeli diversion of water routes, there's no water in the Jordan River because it's all been diverted. But also, I'll give you a personal experience. How they affect us in terms of land and food and how it relates to colonial reality. It also alters our cultural identities, our cultural experiences, our cultural background. So, for example, the first time I went to Puerto Rico was 1976. The next time I went to Puerto Rico and drove all over the island in 84. Everywhere we went, I realized that Puerto Rico is a Latin American country. Because once you left San Juan, the capital, no one spoke English and everything was of a Latin American nature. You got a central plaza, you had the city hall, you had the church, you had the park, and no commercial entities around it. 30 years later, what do we have around the island of Puerto Rico in every plaza? Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, the American products that we are so familiar with, and it's resulting what? The obesity, diabetes, and also children don't want the rice and beans anymore. Now they want the McDonald's. It distorts the nature of people's culture, history, identity, and also health. Because of course now they're eating McDonald's and all the resulting, and I remember reflecting on that, and I think in Palestine it's also somewhat an impact. I don't have full knowledge of all of it, and it's being contested, but it is reflected. You see it in Ramallah, which is a neoliberal product. And in the well, I won't speak because I'm not, I'll let Rabab say it, but Rabab calls it Disneyland, okay? And it is a Disneyland because it's an artificial creation. And what does it have that it promotes? The American, European conception of social engagement. Cafes, overpriced cafes, all of these so-called products that really, well, I'm not opposed to it because I love all that stuff myself, but it's in contestation with the traditional forms of social interaction, engagement, food, culture, whatever. And this is, I think, another reality that gets reflected, especially, and that's why I think education and teaching and challenging is also important, because we have to challenge this with the knowledge of where we come from and where we're going, right? And I think in the one last thing I'll say, I think in relationship to the question of how do we claim victories, we also have to always remember what Amilcar Cabral said. Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. We all want easy victories. We all look for it. So when we see certain developments, we always say, look, we grab onto it and we try to project it beyond maybe even what it is. But we also have to teach that everything is contextual. SJP, for example, is a very phenomenal development and hopefully grows further. But it is nowhere today at the level that SNCC, which was rooted with a mass struggle that was going on, that was inseparable and integral and part of and promoted part of that struggle. So that's where I think we need to always contextualize and promote further the developments that we look forward to.
I just have a question, and I think since this is teaching about Palestine, all of us to think about why teach Palestine? Like, what's the purpose of teaching it? And how would that affect, right, how you teach it, what you teach, the analogies you use, if you use any at all, right? And because I think there's an assumption here, right, about let's teach Palestine, but I think it's really important for us to think about why and for what purpose. So.
I wanted to add this, in terms of teaching Palestine to Haitians and even Haitian activists who are supposed to already have certain lenses of analysis. To go back to your question about the multiracial panel, in Haiti, the elite are Arabs, right? So how do I teach Haitians to think about being in solidarity with Palestinians when they're like
the color of wealth,
right? Yeah. When the people up the hill, right, are from this exact region, right? And so, what is the trickster thing that I can use for people to understand that it's beyond these racial markers and it's about something larger, bigger, right? And to distinguish these elites from other Palestinians. I think that's the other piece that's important, right? And even I have this discussion a lot with folks about, right? There are Haitian elites who are of African descent who oppress Haitians, right? So that there are ways we can complicate some of these conversations, but this is a challenge that I have among activists when I bring up Palestine. They're like, oh yeah, that's over there, right? And so this is part of my job to figure out what's that trickster thing, right? And when I start talking about food sovereignty and occupation and land, and people are like, okay, I'm hearing you, because it's delinking it from, how white supremacy has organized us around these racial categories that are made to separate us and separate our issues.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is the project is called Teaching Palestine, Pedagogical, Praxis, and the Indivisibility of Justice. So we're actually using Palestine as an example of questions of injustice. So Palestine is not exceptionalized, and also Palestine is not about a Palestinian identity per se. So people are not in solidarity with everything Palestinian. Nobody's asking, and we would be the last people to ask people to be in solidarity with the Palestinian Authority, or with my buddy from my homie who's building Rawabi, or I mean that's not, or the I mean this is not the kind of this is not what Palestine here really stands for, the question of justice, and as such we do have to hold accountable the people who are engaged in exploitation, the people who are engaged in exploitation of other Palestinian or other people, because it's if you only think about it only Palestinian nationality or Palestinian nationalism, or you think about it in terms of only racial categories, without actually talking about the whole other questions of capitalism, of militarism, of sexism, of homophobia, of all sorts of discrimination and exclusions and so on, we won't be able to, we can't even talk about Palestine in Palestine. We cannot talk about Palestine in Palestine because we will be reifying colonial structures that are actually very oppressive of other people, whether you talk about Palestinians or non-Palestinians.
So we're at time. Thank you so much, Professor Kenneth Esteban. Going to go catch a plane. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the participants in the audience for using critical insights from all. And I want to see this continue. This is a really amazing project. And as Professor Abdulhadi said, call for papers is released. It will be released soon in English, Arabic.
Today or tomorrow.
And today and tomorrow. You will see it. So thank you so much.